Throughout centuries of biblical study and theological discussion, there's one story that has remained largely untold, hidden beneath layers of familiar narratives and overlooked passages. While most people can recite the tale of Cain and Abel, the first brothers whose rivalry ended in tragedy, very few know about the daughters who walked alongside them in humanity's earliest days. These weren't just background figures in the grand narrative of creation. They were real women with names, stories, and destinies that shaped the very foundation of human civilization. Tonight, we're venturing into territory that most biblical scholars rarely explore, uncovering secrets preserved in ancient texts that have been gathering dust for millennia. What we're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about humanity's first family. Because buried within the pages of forgotten manuscripts lies evidence of daughters whose lives were far more significant than anyone ever imagined. Before we begin this journey together, I need to share something with you. This isn't just another retelling of familiar biblical stories. What we're about to explore comes from sources that most people have never heard of. Documents that were once considered sacred by early Jewish and Christian communities, but somehow disappeared from mainstream religious education. These aren't recent discoveries or modern interpretations. These are ancient testimonies that have been waiting centuries for someone to bring them back into the light. The Book of Jubilees, sometimes called the Little Genesis, contains detailed accounts of events that the standard biblical text only hints at. Dating back over 2,000 years, this remarkable document preserves traditions that were passed down through generations of Jewish scholars and early Christian communities. But here's what makes this even more intriguing. Multiple independent sources from different cultures and time periods tell remarkably similar stories about these forgotten daughters, suggesting we're dealing with genuine historical memories rather than mere folklore. What you're about to hear tonight will answer questions that have puzzled biblical readers for generations. Questions like, where did Cain find his wife after being banished from his family? How did human civilization spread so rapidly in the ancient world? Why do genetic studies point to diverse populations existing from humanity's earliest periods? The answers lie with the daughters of Adam and Eve, women whose stories have been hidden in plain sight for thousands of years. But I must warn you about something before we go any further. What we're about to uncover isn't just academically interesting, it's personally transformative. Because these ancient accounts reveal truths about human nature, family dynamics, and the complexity of early civilization that will change how you read every biblical passage from now on. You'll never look at the opening chapters of Genesis the same way again. Most people assume they know the story of humanity's beginning, Adam and Eve in the garden, the forbidden fruit, the expulsion, then Cain and Abel. Simple, straightforward, complete. But what if that's just the surface layer of a much deeper, more complex narrative? What if the biblical authors assumed their readers already knew details that have been lost to modern audiences? What if there were entire chapters of human history that we've been missing? The truth is, Adam and Eve didn't just have 3 sons mentioned by name in Scripture. According to multiple ancient sources, they had dozens of children, perhaps even hundreds, during their extraordinarily long lifespans. The biblical text itself confirms this in Genesis chapter 5, stating that after Seth was born, Adam lived another 800 years and had many sons and daughters. But who were these daughters? What were their names? What roles did they play in establishing human civilization? These questions have haunted biblical scholars for centuries, but the answers have been hiding in texts that were once widely known but gradually faded from common knowledge. Tonight, we're bringing those answers back into the light, revealing the never-told story of the daughters who helped shape humanity's destiny. Let me paint a picture of what we're dealing with here. Imagine living in a world where every human being on Earth could trace their lineage back to a single family, where the decisions made by the first generation would echo through all of human history, where the daughters of that first family weren't just wives and mothers, but pioneers, leaders, and the foundation upon which entire civilizations would be built. This isn't fantasy or speculation. This is what the ancient texts describe as historical reality. The Book of Jubilees, preserved in Ethiopic manuscripts and fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, provides names, dates, and detailed genealogies that fill in the gaps left by the biblical narrative. But it's not alone. The Cave of Treasures, various Jewish traditions, and early Christian writings all preserve similar accounts, suggesting these stories were once common knowledge among ancient communities. What makes this even more remarkable is how these accounts align with modern scientific understanding of human origins. Genetic research points to diverse populations existing from very early periods, multiple lineages developing in parallel, and complex migration patterns that spread humanity across the globe. The ancient texts describe exactly these kinds of scenarios, with different daughters establishing different family lines that would eventually populate different regions of the world. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. These daughters weren't just passive participants in human history. According to the ancient sources, they were active agents who made choices that shaped the destiny of their descendants. Some aligned themselves with righteousness and wisdom. Others chose paths that led to corruption and violence. Their decisions created the foundation for conflicts and alliances that would echo through generations. The first daughter mentioned in these ancient texts was named Awan, a name that carries deep significance in the Hebrew language. She became the wife of Cain, her own brother, in an arrangement that might seem strange to modern readers, but was necessary for the continuation of the human race in those earliest days. But Awan wasn't just a wife. She was a survivor, a woman who stood by her husband even after he committed the first murder in human history. When Cain was banished from the presence of God for killing his brother Abel, Awan went with him into exile. Together, they established the first city mentioned in biblical history, named after their son Enoch. This wasn't just a small settlement. According to the ancient accounts, it was a thriving civilization with advanced knowledge of metallurgy, music, and agriculture. Awan helped establish the foundation of urban life, becoming the mother of technologies and arts that would define human civilization for millennia to come. But Awan's story raises profound questions about the nature of loyalty, survival, and moral complexity in the ancient world. Here was a woman who chose to remain faithful to a husband who had committed an unforgivable crime. Was this admirable devotion or tragic complicity? The ancient texts don't provide easy answers, but they do reveal the impossible choices that the first generation of humanity faced as they tried to build a world from nothing. Then there was Azura, the second daughter, whose story is perhaps even more complex and tragic. According to the Book of Jubilees, Azura was originally married to Abel, the righteous brother who offered acceptable sacrifices to God. She was a young wife, perhaps even expecting their first child, when Cain's jealousy erupted into violence. In a single moment of rage, she lost not just her husband, but her entire future. The ancient texts describe Azura's grief in terms that are both heartbreaking and profound. She had experienced the perfect love of a righteous man, only to watch it destroyed by the hatred of his brother. She had tasted the joy of being part of God's favor, only to be plunged into the darkness of humanity's first great tragedy. But Azura's story didn't end with Abel's death. When Seth was born as a replacement for Abel, Azura found herself in an impossible situation. The ancient traditions describe her as becoming Seth's wife, taking on the role of helping to establish the righteous lineage that would eventually lead to Noah and, according to biblical genealogies, to Christ himself. But imagine the complexity of such an arrangement. She was marrying the brother of both her murdered husband and his killer. She was being asked to help restore what had been broken while carrying the memory of what had been lost. Azura's story reveals something profound about resilience, redemption, and the way God works through human brokenness to accomplish his purposes. She wasn't just a victim of tragedy. She became an agent of restoration, helping to establish the lineage through which blessing would eventually come to all humanity. Her children with Seth would carry forward the knowledge of God and the hope of redemption that had been endangered by Cain's rebellion. But the ancient texts reveal something even more remarkable about these early daughters. They didn't just passively accept their circumstances. They made choices that demonstrated wisdom, courage, and faith that would echo through generations. These weren't women who were merely acted upon by the men around them. They were active participants in shaping the destiny of the human race. The Book of Jubilees provides specific dates and details about these marriages and births, using a complex calendar system that tracks the passage of time in terms of Jubilee years. According to these calculations, Azura was born in the 6th week of the 4th Jubilee and married Seth in the 5th week of the 5th Jubilee. Their first son, Enos, was born in the 4th year of the 6th week. These aren't just random numbers. They represent a sophisticated understanding of chronology that suggests the ancient authors were preserving genuine historical records. What's particularly intriguing is how these genealogies align with the biblical account while providing additional depth and context. The Bible mentions that during the time of Enos, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. The Book of Jubilees explains that this revival of worship was directly connected to the influence of Seth's family line, which had been established through his marriage to Azura. In other words, the spiritual renewal described in Genesis was made possible by the choices and faithfulness of Adam and Eve's daughters. But there were more daughters, many more. The ancient texts describe dozens of women who played crucial roles in establishing the various branches of humanity that would eventually populate the earth. Some of their names have been preserved in these forgotten manuscripts. Others are mentioned only in passing, their individual stories lost to time, but their collective impact undeniable. Each of these daughters faced the same fundamental challenge that confronts every human being in every generation. How do you respond to a broken world? How do you build something beautiful from the ruins of paradise? How do you maintain hope when everything around you seems to be falling apart? The daughters of Adam and Eve were the first women in history to grapple with these questions, and their answers shaped the destiny of everyone who would come after them. What makes their stories even more remarkable is the context in which they lived. These weren't women who had the benefit of thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, religious traditions, or cultural institutions to guide them. They were pioneers in the truest sense, making decisions about marriage, family, worship, and society without any precedent to follow. Every choice they made was setting a pattern that would influence countless generations. The ancient texts describe a world where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual realms were much more fluid than they are today. These early daughters lived in a time when the memory of Eden was still fresh, when the consequences of the fall were still being worked out, when the very nature of human existence was still being defined. They were witnesses to miracles and tragedies that would become the foundation stories of human civilization. But perhaps most significantly, these daughters were the first women to experience the full range of human emotions and relationships in a fallen world. They knew the joy of love and the pain of loss. They experienced the hope of new life and the fear of death. They felt the satisfaction of building something lasting and the frustration of watching it crumble. In their stories, we see reflected all the complexity, beauty, and tragedy of human existence. As we prepare to dive deeper into their individual stories, I want you to consider something profound. These weren't just women who lived a long time ago in a world very different from ours. They were the first representatives of womanhood itself, the pioneers who established patterns of strength, wisdom, and faith that continue to influence women today. Their DNA flows through every human being on Earth. Their choices echo in our choices. Their struggles mirror our struggles. The never-told story of the daughters of Adam and Eve isn't just ancient history. It's the foundation upon which all human history is built. And as we uncover their individual stories, we'll discover truths about human nature, divine purpose, and the meaning of existence that have been hidden for far too long. Tonight, we're about to pull back the curtain on secrets that have been deliberately hidden from mainstream religious education for centuries. Because what we're dealing with here isn't just missing information about ancient genealogies. We're looking at evidence of a systematic removal of feminine voices from the historical record. Stories that were once considered essential knowledge but somehow disappeared from the texts that shaped Western civilization. The implications of what we're about to discover are staggering, because if these ancient accounts are accurate, If these daughters of Adam and Eve truly played the roles described in these forgotten manuscripts, then everything we've been taught about early human civilization needs to be completely reconsidered. We're not just talking about adding a few names to family trees. We're talking about recognizing an entire dimension of human history that has been overlooked, ignored, or deliberately suppressed. Let me share with you something that will fundamentally change how you understand the biblical narrative. When most people read the story of Cain's banishment in Genesis chapter 4, they encounter a puzzling detail that biblical scholars have struggled to explain for centuries. After killing his brother Abel, Cain expresses fear that whoever finds him will kill him. Then the text mentions that Cain went to the land of Nod, where he knew his wife and built a city. The question that has haunted readers for generations is simple yet profound. Who were these other people that Cain feared, and where did his wife come from? Traditional explanations have suggested that Adam and Eve must have had other children not mentioned in the biblical account, and that Cain married one of his sisters, but this explanation has always felt incomplete, even forced. It requires us to assume details not provided in the text while ignoring the clear implications of what is actually written. The ancient sources we're exploring tonight provide a completely different answer, one that makes perfect sense of these mysterious details. According to the Book of Jubilees and other ancient texts, the world in which Cain lived was already populated with multiple family lines, different branches of humanity that had developed distinct cultures, technologies, and ways of life. Cain's fear wasn't about encountering random descendants of his own parents. It was about entering territories controlled by established communities that had their own leaders, their own laws, and their own reasons for potentially viewing him as a threat. But here's where the story of the daughters becomes absolutely crucial to understanding what was really happening in the ancient world. These weren't just individual women making personal choices about marriage and family. They were the founders of distinct lineages that would eventually develop into separate peoples, cultures, and civilizations. Each daughter who married and had children was essentially establishing a new branch of humanity, complete with its own characteristics, capabilities, and destiny. The ancient texts describe these daughters as possessing remarkable wisdom and foresight. They understood that their choices would have consequences that would ripple through generations. They knew that the men they married, the children they raised, and the values they instilled would shape entire peoples. This wasn't just personal decision-making. This was the conscious creation of human civilization itself. Consider the profound responsibility that rested on these women's shoulders. They were living in a world where there were no established traditions, no cultural institutions, no accumulated wisdom about how to build lasting societies. Every choice they made was setting a precedent. Every decision was creating a template that would influence countless generations. They were literally writing the first chapters of human history through their daily choices about how to live, how to love, and how to raise their children. The Book of Jubilees provides fascinating details about the different characteristics that emerged in these various lineages. Some daughters established family lines known for their skill in metallurgy and craftsmanship. Others became the mothers of musicians and artists. Still others founded lineages known for their agricultural innovations or their spiritual devotion. It's as if each daughter was carrying specific gifts and abilities that would become the defining characteristics of entire peoples. But what makes this even more remarkable is how these ancient accounts align with what we know about early human migrations and the development of distinct cultures around the world. Genetic research has revealed that human populations spread across the globe much earlier than previously thought, establishing distinct communities with unique characteristics in different regions. The ancient texts describe exactly this kind of scenario, with different daughters and their descendants establishing themselves in different parts of the world. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of these ancient accounts. They don't just describe the daughters of Adam and Eve as passive recipients of their circumstances. They portray them as active agents who made strategic decisions about where to live, whom to marry, and how to establish their communities. Some chose to remain close to their parents, maintaining the traditions and practices that had been established in the earliest days. Others ventured into unknown territories, adapting to new environments and developing new ways of life. The daughter named Awan, for instance, didn't just passively follow her husband Cain into exile. According to the ancient texts, she made a conscious choice to stand by him despite his crime, understanding that someone needed to help him establish a new life in the land of Nod. Her decision to accompany him wasn't just personal loyalty. It was a strategic choice that would determine the character of the entire civilization that would emerge from their union. The city that Cain built, named after their son Enoch, became, according to these ancient accounts, a center of innovation and learning. It was there that the first advances in metallurgy were made, where musical instruments were invented, where agricultural techniques were developed that would eventually spread throughout the ancient world. Awan wasn't just present for these developments. She was actively involved in fostering the kind of environment where innovation and creativity could flourish. But the ancient texts also reveal the darker side of these early developments. The same knowledge and capabilities that made civilization possible also opened the door to corruption and violence. The descendants of Cain, according to these accounts, became known not just for their technological achievements, but also for their moral degradation. They developed weapons of war, practices of exploitation, and systems of oppression that would plague human civilization for millennia to come. This pattern of innovation accompanied by corruption becomes a recurring theme in these ancient accounts. Each daughter who established a new lineage was creating not just the potential for good, but also the possibility of evil. Their descendants would have the same capacity for both creativity and destruction, the same ability to build up or tear down, the same potential for righteousness or wickedness. The story of Azura provides a particularly powerful example of how these early choices created lasting consequences. Her marriage to Seth after the death of her first husband Abel represented more than just personal healing from tragedy. It represented the establishment of a lineage that would carry forward the knowledge of God and the hope of redemption through the darkest periods of human history. According to the Book of Jubilees, Azura played a crucial role in teaching her children about the worship of God, the importance of righteousness, and the hope of eventual restoration. She was the one who preserved the memory of Abel's acceptable sacrifice, who explained to her children why some offerings were pleasing to God while others were rejected. She was the keeper of spiritual traditions that would eventually lead to the establishment of formal religious practices and institutions. But Azura's influence extended far beyond religious instruction. The ancient texts describe her as a woman of remarkable practical wisdom, who helped establish patterns of agriculture, animal husbandry, and community organization that would characterize the righteous lineage for generations. She wasn't just a spiritual teacher. She was a practical guide who helped her descendants learn how to live successfully in a fallen world while maintaining their connection to divine purposes. The son she bore to Seth, named Enos, became, according to biblical accounts, the leader of a spiritual revival during which people began to call upon the name of the Lord. But the ancient texts reveal that this revival didn't happen spontaneously. It was the result of careful teaching and preparation that had been taking place in Seth's household, much of it guided by Azura's wisdom and influence. This pattern of feminine influence shaping spiritual and cultural development appears throughout these ancient accounts. Again and again, we see daughters of Adam and Eve who weren't just supporting their husbands' endeavors but actively shaping the direction of their communities. They were teachers, counselors, innovators, and leaders who helped determine the character of the civilizations that emerged from their unions. But perhaps most significantly, these daughters were the first women in history to grapple with questions that continue to challenge women today. How do you maintain your identity and influence in a world dominated by masculine power structures? How do you pass on values and traditions to the next generation when those traditions are under constant threat? How do you balance personal desires with communal responsibilities? How do you find meaning and purpose when your contributions are often overlooked or undervalued? The ancient texts reveal that these weren't just modern questions. They were fundamental challenges that women have always faced, questions that were first confronted by the daughters of Adam and Eve as they tried to build meaningful lives in a broken world. Their answers, their strategies, Their successes and failures became the foundation upon which all subsequent generations of women would build their own responses to these eternal challenges. What makes their stories even more remarkable is the context of absolute pioneering in which they lived. These weren't women who could look to role models or establish traditions for guidance. They were creating the very concept of womanhood itself, establishing patterns of behavior, relationship, and influence that would echo through all of human history. Every choice they made was setting a precedent that would influence countless generations of women who would come after them. The ancient accounts describe these daughters as possessing not just practical wisdom, but also prophetic insight. They understood that their decisions would have consequences far beyond their immediate circumstances. They could see how their choices would influence their children, their grandchildren, and entire lineages that would emerge from their unions. This wasn't just maternal instinct. This was strategic thinking of the highest order, the ability to see patterns and consequences that extended far into the future. But with this insight came tremendous responsibility, and according to the ancient texts, tremendous pressure. These women knew that the future of humanity literally depended on their choices. They understood that a single wrong decision could doom entire lineages to corruption and destruction. They felt the weight of being the first representatives of womanhood, the pioneers who would establish patterns that would influence every woman who would ever live. The Book of Jubilees describes moments when these daughters sought divine guidance for their decisions, understanding that they were dealing with responsibilities too great for human wisdom alone. They developed practices of prayer, meditation, and spiritual discernment that would become the foundation for religious traditions that continue to this day. They weren't just making personal choices. They were establishing spiritual disciplines that would guide human behavior for millennia. As we prepare to explore the individual stories of these remarkable women in even greater detail, I want you to consider the profound implications of what we're discovering. These weren't just ancient women whose stories happened to be interesting. They were the architects of human civilization, the founders of lineages that would eventually populate the entire earth, the pioneers who established patterns of behavior and belief that continue to influence our world today. Their DNA flows through every human being on the planet. Their choices echo in our choices. Their struggles mirror our struggles. Their victories and defeats shape the very foundation upon which all human history has been built. Understanding their stories isn't just academic curiosity. It's essential knowledge for anyone who wants to understand the true nature of human existence and the forces that continue to shape our world. The never-told story of the daughters of Adam and Eve is about to reveal secrets that will transform how you understand not just ancient history, but the very meaning of what it means to be human in a world that bears the marks of both paradise and rebellion, both divine purpose and human failure. But the ancient texts reveal something that will shake you to your core about these early daughters. They weren't just establishing different family lines through their marriages. They were creating entirely different approaches to knowledge, power, and the fundamental questions of human existence. Some daughters chose paths that led their descendants toward divine wisdom and righteous living. Others, according to these forgotten manuscripts, made choices that opened doorways to corruption and forbidden knowledge that would plague humanity for generations. The third daughter mentioned in these ancient sources was named Luluwa, a name that carries deep significance in the ancient Hebrew language. According to the Cave of Treasures and other early texts, Luluwa was born as a twin to Abel, making her connection to the first murder even more profound and tragic. She was described as possessing extraordinary beauty and wisdom, characteristics that would make her the center of a conflict that would echo through human history. The ancient accounts describe Luluwa as being originally intended as Abel's wife, part of a divine plan to establish a righteous lineage through the union of the most spiritually minded of Adam's children. But Cain's jealousy wasn't just about Abel's acceptable sacrifice to God. It was also about Luluwa, the beautiful sister who represented everything that Cain desired but felt he could never possess. This adds an entirely new dimension to the world's first murder, revealing it as not just a crime of religious jealousy, but also a crime of passion and possession. When Abel was killed, Luluwa found herself in an impossible position. She had lost not just her intended husband, but her twin brother, the one person who truly understood her spiritual nature and divine calling. The ancient texts describe her grief as so profound that it changed the very atmosphere of the early world, introducing a depth of sorrow that humanity had never before experienced. But more than that, her mourning became the foundation for all human expressions of grief and loss that would follow. According to these forgotten manuscripts, Luluwa made a choice that would alter the course of human history. Rather than marry into Cain's lineage or even consider Seth as a replacement for Abel, she chose to remain unmarried, dedicating her life to preserving the memory of Abel's righteousness and the knowledge of proper worship that would otherwise have been lost. She became, in essence, the first celibate religious devotee in human history, establishing a pattern of spiritual dedication that would influence countless generations. But Luluwa's influence extended far beyond her personal choices. The ancient texts describe her as becoming a teacher and prophet, someone who could see into the future and understand the consequences of the choices being made by her family members. She warned about the corruption that would come from Cain's lineage. She prophesied about the flood that would eventually cleanse the earth. She preserved knowledge and traditions that would prove crucial for humanity's survival during the darkest periods ahead. Her teachings, according to these ancient sources, became the foundation for what would later be called the Daughter's Tradition, a body of spiritual knowledge and practice that was passed down through the feminine line of humanity. This wasn't just religious instruction. It was a comprehensive understanding of how to maintain connection with the divine while living in a fallen world, how to preserve righteousness in the face of corruption, and how to hope for redemption even in the midst of judgment. The Book of Jubilees describes specific rituals and practices that Luluwa established, ceremonies that would help future generations remember the paradise that was lost and maintain hope for the restoration that was promised. These weren't just symbolic actions. They were practical disciplines that helped people navigate the complexities of life in a world where the boundaries between good and evil were constantly being tested. But perhaps most significantly, Luluwa's story reveals the beginning of a pattern that would repeat throughout human history. The choice between worldly success and spiritual faithfulness, between immediate satisfaction and eternal purpose, between conforming to cultural expectations and maintaining divine calling. Her decision to remain unmarried and dedicate herself to spiritual service established a template that would influence countless women throughout history who would face similar choices. The ancient texts describe how Luluwa's influence spread far beyond her immediate family. People from distant lands would come to seek her wisdom and guidance. Her teachings were preserved and passed down through generations, creating a network of spiritual knowledge that would survive even the most devastating catastrophes. She became, in essence, the first woman to establish what we might today call a religious order, a community of people dedicated to preserving and transmitting divine truth. But the story takes an even more fascinating turn when we consider the fourth daughter mentioned in these ancient sources. Her name was Kalmana, and according to the Book of Jubilees, she represented an entirely different approach to the challenges facing humanity in those early days. Where Luluwa chose spiritual dedication and celibacy, Kalmana chose strategic marriage and political influence. Kalmana was described as possessing not just beauty, but also remarkable intelligence and diplomatic skills. She understood that the future of humanity would depend not just on spiritual devotion, but also on practical wisdom about how to build stable communities, establish trade relationships, and create the kind of social structures that would allow civilization to flourish. Her approach to these challenges was fundamentally different from her sisters, but equally important for humanity's survival. According to the ancient texts, Kalmana married into what would later be called the line of the giants, descendants of the unions between the sons of God and the daughters of men mentioned in Genesis chapter 6. This wasn't just a personal choice. It was a strategic decision designed to bridge the gap between the purely human lineages and the mysterious beings who had introduced new knowledge and capabilities into the world. The implications of this marriage were staggering. Kalmana's children would possess not just human characteristics, but also access to knowledge and abilities that transcended normal human limitations. They would become the founders of the great civilizations mentioned in ancient texts, the builders of the megalithic structures that still puzzle archaeologists today, the developers of technologies that seem impossible for their supposed time period. But this knowledge came with a terrible price. The ancient texts describe how Kalmana's descendants gradually became corrupted by the power they possessed. They began to see themselves as superior to ordinary humans, deserving of worship and obedience. They developed systems of oppression and exploitation that would plague human civilization for millennia. They became, in essence, the first ruling class in human history, establishing patterns of inequality and injustice that continue to influence our world today. Kalmana's story reveals something profound about the nature of power and knowledge. The same capabilities that make civilization possible also create the potential for unprecedented corruption. The same wisdom that can elevate human existence can also be used to dominate and exploit. Her choices, made with the best of intentions, created consequences that would echo through all of human history. The ancient texts describe moments when Kalmana began to understand the full implications of her choices. She saw how her descendants were using their enhanced abilities not to serve humanity, but to rule over it. She watched as the knowledge she had helped preserve was being twisted into instruments of oppression. She realized that her strategic thinking had created problems that would require divine intervention to solve. But even in her regret, Kalmana's story reveals something important about the complexity of moral choice in a fallen world. She had faced an impossible situation with no perfect solutions. Every choice available to her carried the potential for both good and evil. Her decision to marry into the line of the giants was an attempt to preserve knowledge and capabilities that might otherwise have been lost. But it also created opportunities for corruption that she couldn't have fully anticipated. This pattern of unintended consequences becomes a recurring theme in the stories of Adam and Eve's daughters. Again and again, we see women making choices that seem reasonable, even noble at the time, but that create problems and challenges that will plague future generations. Their stories reveal the tragic reality that in a fallen world, even the best intentions can lead to devastating outcomes. The fifth daughter mentioned in these ancient sources was named Dinah, not to be confused with the later biblical figure of the same name. According to the Book of Jubilees, this earlier Dinah was born during the period when her parents were beginning to understand the full implications of their expulsion from Eden. She grew up in a world where the memory of paradise was still fresh, but where the realities of life outside the garden were becoming increasingly apparent. Dinah's story is particularly tragic because she represents the first generation of women who had no direct experience of the divine presence, but who carried the genetic and spiritual heritage of those who had walked with God in Eden. She inherited both the capacity for righteousness and the tendency toward rebellion, both the longing for divine connection and the frustration of living in a world where that connection had been severely damaged. The ancient texts describe Dinah as being torn between different visions of what human life should be. She was attracted to the spiritual devotion represented by her sister Luluwa, but she was also drawn to the practical power represented by Kalmana. She wanted to serve God, but she also wanted to build something lasting in the physical world. She desired righteousness, but she also craved the kind of success and recognition that seemed to come only through compromise. According to these forgotten manuscripts, Dinah eventually chose to marry one of the descendants of Cain, a decision that horrified her parents and siblings. This wasn't just a personal choice about love or compatibility. It was a theological and political decision that would determine the character of her descendants for generations to come. By marrying into Cain's lineage, she was essentially choosing to align herself with the first murderer's approach to life, rather than with the righteous lineage that had been established through Seth. But Dinah's story reveals something profound about the nature of human choice and divine sovereignty. Even her decision to marry into Cain's line became part of a larger pattern that would ultimately serve divine purposes. Her descendants would carry forward certain knowledge and capabilities that would prove crucial during later periods of human history. They would serve as bridges between different communities and cultures, helping to preserve and transmit important traditions during times of crisis and upheaval. The ancient texts describe how Dinah's marriage created a new kind of lineage, one that combined the technological innovations of Cain's descendants with the spiritual sensitivity inherited from Adam and Eve's direct line. This wasn't just genetic mixing. It was the creation of a new approach to human existence that would influence the development of civilization in ways that neither lineage could have achieved alone. Her children, according to these accounts, became the founders of the great trading networks that would connect distant civilizations. They developed systems of communication and transportation that would allow knowledge and resources to flow across vast distances. They established the first international relationships, creating bonds between different peoples that would survive even the most devastating conflicts. But perhaps most significantly, Dinah's descendants became the preservers of historical memory. They were the ones who maintained the records, told the stories, and passed down the traditions that would otherwise have been lost. They became, in essence, the first historians and librarians in human history, ensuring that the knowledge gained through both triumph and tragedy would be available to future generations. The sixth daughter mentioned in these ancient sources was named Mahalath, a name that means sickness or weakness in Hebrew. But according to the Book of Jubilees, this name was deeply ironic because Mahalath was described as being the physically strongest and most resilient of all Adam and Eve's daughters. She was born during a period when disease and death were becoming increasingly common in the world, and her strength became a symbol of hope for a family that was learning to cope with the harsh realities of life outside Eden. Mahalath's story reveals something important about the relationship between physical strength and spiritual calling. Unlike her sisters, who were known primarily for their beauty, wisdom, or spiritual devotion, Mahalath was distinguished by her ability to endure hardship and overcome obstacles. She became the protector of her family, the one who could be counted on when danger threatened or when difficult tasks needed to be accomplished. The ancient texts describe how Mahalath took on responsibilities that had traditionally been assigned to men. She learned to hunt, to fight, to build, and to lead. She wasn't rejecting her femininity, but rather expanding the definition of what it meant to be a woman in a world that was becoming increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. Her strength wasn't just physical, but also emotional and spiritual, the kind of resilience that would prove essential for humanity's survival. According to these forgotten manuscripts, Mahalath eventually married one of the descendants of Seth, but her choice of husband was based not on romantic attraction or family alliance, but on shared commitment to the values and purposes that would preserve righteousness in the world. She was looking for a partner who could match her strength and dedication, someone who would help her establish a lineage known for its courage and faithfulness. Her descendants, according to the ancient accounts, became the warriors and protectors of the righteous lineage. They were the ones who stood guard against the corruption spreading from other family lines. They developed the martial skills and strategic thinking that would prove crucial during the violent periods that preceded the flood. They became, in essence, the first military force dedicated to protecting divine purposes in a world increasingly hostile to righteousness. But Mahalath's influence extended far beyond military matters. The ancient texts describe her as establishing training programs for both men and women, teaching them not just how to fight, but how to think strategically about long-term survival. She understood that physical strength without wisdom was useless, that courage without purpose was dangerous, and that protection without righteousness was ultimately meaningless. Her teachings, according to these sources, became the foundation for what would later be called the warrior tradition among the righteous lineage. This wasn't just about combat skills. It was a comprehensive approach to life that emphasized discipline, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to divine purposes, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. The seventh daughter mentioned in these ancient texts was named Nama, sharing a name with the later biblical figure but representing an entirely different branch of humanity's development. According to the Book of Jubilees, this earlier Nama was born during the period when the arts and sciences were beginning to flourish among humanity's scattered tribes. She was described as possessing an almost supernatural ability to create beauty and harmony in a world that was becoming increasingly chaotic and violent. Nama's gift wasn't just artistic talent, but something much deeper and more profound. She could see patterns and connections that others missed. She could bring together elements that seemed incompatible and create something beautiful and meaningful from them. She could find harmony in discord, create order from chaos, and bring peace to conflicts that seemed irreconcilable. The ancient texts describe how Nama's influence spread far beyond her immediate family. People from distant lands would come to learn from her, to experience the beauty she created, and to find healing from the harmony she could establish. She became, in essence, the first artist healer in human history, using creativity and beauty as tools for restoration and redemption. But Nama's story also reveals the dangerous potential of artistic gifts in a fallen world. Her ability to create beauty and harmony could be used to deceive as well as to heal, to manipulate as well as to inspire. The ancient texts describe how some of her descendants used their inherited abilities not to serve divine purposes, but to advance their own agendas, creating beautiful lies that were more seductive than ugly truths. This pattern of creative gifts being used for both good and evil becomes another recurring theme in these ancient accounts. The same abilities that make civilization possible also create opportunities for unprecedented deception and corruption. The daughters of Adam and Eve were not just establishing different approaches to survival and success. They were creating the fundamental tensions that would define human existence for all generations to come. As we delve deeper into these individual stories, we begin to see a pattern emerging that will transform how you understand not just ancient history, but the very nature of human existence itself. Each daughter represents a different response to the fundamental questions that confront every human being. How do we live meaningfully in a broken world? How do we balance personal desires with cosmic purposes? How do we maintain hope when everything around us seems to be falling apart? Their answers to these questions didn't just affect their own lives. They created templates, patterns, and traditions that would influence every generation that followed. Their choices became the foundation upon which all human civilization would be built. Their struggles became the prototype for every struggle that would follow. But perhaps most significantly, their stories reveal that the questions they faced weren't just ancient problems. They were eternal challenges that continue to confront every human being in every generation. The same tensions, the same choices, the same consequences that shaped their lives continue to shape our lives today. The never-told story of the daughters of Adam and Eve isn't just about understanding the past. It's about recognizing the patterns that continue to influence our present and will determine our future. Because the truth is, we are all still living in the world that these women helped create. Still dealing with the consequences of their choices, still faced with the same fundamental questions that they had to answer. Their DNA flows through our veins. Their choices echo in our choices. Their victories and defeats continue to shape the very fabric of human existence. Understanding their stories isn't just academic curiosity. It's essential knowledge for anyone who wants to understand the true nature of the human condition and the forces that continue to shape our world. The ancient texts reveal that these daughters weren't just passive participants in human history. They were active agents who made deliberate choices about the kind of world they wanted to create and the kind of legacy they wanted to leave. Their stories challenge us to consider what kind of choices we are making and what kind of world we are creating through our daily decisions. But to truly understand the full implications of what these women accomplished, we need to explore something that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the relationship between the physical and spiritual realms in the ancient world. Because according to these forgotten manuscripts, the daughters of Adam and Eve weren't just establishing different human lineages. They were creating pathways between dimensions, opening doorways to knowledge and power that would transform the very nature of human existence. The ancient texts describe abilities and achievements that seem impossible by modern standards, suggesting that the early world operated according to different principles than the one we know today. These daughters weren't just remarkable women. They were pioneers who explored the boundaries of human potential and discovered capabilities that would later be forgotten or deliberately suppressed. Their stories reveal a world where the distinction between natural and supernatural was much more fluid, where human beings had access to knowledge and abilities that transcended the limitations we take for granted today. They were living in a time when the consequences of Paradise Lost were still being worked out, when the full implications of the fall hadn't yet been realized, when possibilities existed that would later be closed off forever. Understanding their achievements requires us to expand our conception of what human beings are capable of, and to consider the possibility that we have lost more than we have gained in our journey from the ancient world to the modern one. Their stories aren't just about the past. They're about possibilities that still exist, potentials that still await discovery, and purposes that still await fulfillment. The never-told story of the daughters of Adam and Eve is about to reveal secrets that will not only transform your understanding of history, but also awaken you to possibilities you never knew existed. Because the truth is, their story isn't finished. It continues in every woman who chooses to embrace her calling, every person who decides to live for purposes greater than themselves, and every generation that dares to believe that the world can be better than it is. Their legacy isn't just in the past, it's in the future that we are still creating, the choices we are still making, and the world we are still building. The daughters of Adam and Eve established the foundation. Now it's up to us to complete the structure they began. The eighth daughter mentioned in these ancient texts was named Keturah, though this is a different Keturah from the one later mentioned as Abraham's wife. According to the Book of Jubilees, this earlier Keturah was born during the period when humanity was beginning to understand the true scope of their separation from Eden. She was described as possessing an almost mystical ability to communicate with the natural world, to understand the languages of animals, and to perceive the spiritual forces that moved through creation. Keturah's gift wasn't just intuitive connection with nature. She could read the signs written in the movements of stars, the patterns of weather, and the behavior of creatures. She became humanity's first prophet of the natural world, someone who could interpret the messages that creation itself was trying to communicate to its fallen stewards. Her insights weren't just practical knowledge about agriculture or animal husbandry. They were spiritual revelations about the cosmic order that had been disrupted by humanity's rebellion. The ancient texts describe how Keturah established the first schools of natural wisdom, teaching others how to read the book of creation and understand the divine purposes that were still being worked out through natural processes. She wasn't just observing nature. She was discovering the hidden connections between the physical and spiritual realms that had been severed by the fall but not completely destroyed. But Keturah's story reveals something that will shake your understanding of how the ancient world really functioned. According to these forgotten manuscripts, she could do more than just interpret natural signs. She could actually influence natural processes through what the texts describe as righteous dominion, the kind of authority over creation that humanity had originally been given but had lost through disobedience. The Book of Jubilees describes instances where Keturah could call rain during droughts, cause barren land to become fertile, and even communicate with wild animals to protect her community from danger. These weren't just legends or exaggerations. They were historical accounts of a woman who had learned to exercise the kind of dominion over creation that had been humanity's original calling. Her descendants, according to these ancient sources, became the keepers of agricultural and environmental wisdom that would prove crucial for humanity's survival during the difficult periods ahead. They developed techniques for working with natural systems rather than against them, creating sustainable communities that could thrive even in harsh environments. They became, in essence, the first environmental scientists and agricultural engineers in human history. But perhaps most significantly, Keturah's lineage preserved knowledge about the relationship between human behavior and natural consequences that would later be forgotten by most of humanity. They understood that moral corruption led to environmental degradation, that spiritual rebellion resulted in natural disasters, and that redemption and restoration were possible when human beings aligned themselves with divine purposes. The ninth daughter mentioned in these texts was named Deborah, sharing a name with the later biblical judge, but representing an entirely different aspect of feminine leadership in the ancient world. According to the Cave of Treasures, this earlier Deborah was born during the period when conflicts between different human lineages were becoming increasingly common and violent. She was described as possessing remarkable abilities in what we might today call conflict resolution and diplomatic negotiation. Deborah's gift wasn't just personal charisma or persuasive ability. She could see through deception, understand hidden motives, and find common ground between parties that seemed to have irreconcilable differences. She became humanity's first professional mediator, someone who could prevent conflicts from escalating into violence and help communities resolve disputes in ways that strengthened rather than weakened their bonds. The ancient texts describe how Deborah's influence spread far beyond her immediate family and community. Leaders from distant tribes would seek her counsel when facing difficult decisions. Her reputation for wisdom and fairness became legendary, establishing patterns of justice and reconciliation that would influence legal systems for generations to come. But Deborah's story reveals something profound about the nature of leadership and authority in the ancient world. She wasn't leading through force or manipulation, but through moral authority and spiritual insight. Her power came not from position or wealth, but from her ability to help others discover truth and find solutions that served everyone's best interests. According to these forgotten manuscripts, Deborah established the first formal systems of justice and law among humanity's scattered tribes. She created procedures for resolving disputes, protocols for determining guilt and innocence, and principles for establishing punishments that would restore rather than merely punish. Her legal innovations weren't just practical solutions to immediate problems. They were attempts to reflect divine justice in human institutions. Her descendants, according to the ancient accounts, became the judges and lawmakers of the righteous lineage. They were the ones who preserved and transmitted the principles of justice that would eventually be codified in formal legal systems. They became, in essence, the first lawyers and judges in human history, establishing precedents that would influence legal thinking for millennia. But the ancient texts also reveal that Deborah faced challenges that would test her commitment to justice and truth. Some of her own family members became involved in conflicts that seemed to have no just resolution. Some of the disputes she was asked to mediate involved people she loved on both sides. Some of the decisions she had to make would inevitably cause pain and disappointment to people she cared about. Her story reveals the lonely burden that comes with moral leadership, the isolation that accompanies the responsibility to make difficult decisions based on principle rather than personal preference. She had to learn to distinguish between justice and mercy, between truth and compassion, between what was right and what was popular. The 10th daughter mentioned in these ancient sources was named Miriam, again sharing a name with the later biblical prophet, but representing a different aspect of feminine spiritual leadership. According to the Book of Jubilees, this earlier Miriam was born during the period when worship practices were becoming formalized among humanity's various communities. She was described as possessing extraordinary abilities in what we might today call liturgical and ceremonial leadership. Miriam's gift wasn't just musical talent or ritual knowledge. She could create worship experiences that connected people with divine realities in ways that transformed their understanding of themselves and their world. She became humanity's first liturgist, someone who could craft ceremonies and celebrations that helped communities remember their divine calling and renew their commitment to righteous living. The ancient texts describe how Miriam's innovations in worship spread throughout the ancient world, influencing religious practices among both righteous and corrupted lineages. Her understanding of how music, movement, and ritual could affect human consciousness became the foundation for religious traditions that would endure for thousands of years. But Miriam's story reveals something that will challenge your understanding of the relationship between worship and power in the ancient world. According to these forgotten manuscripts, her ceremonies weren't just symbolic acts or emotional experiences. They were actual spiritual technologies that could influence both individual consciousness and community dynamics in measurable ways. The Book of Jubilees describes instances where Miriam's worship services resulted in miraculous healings, prophetic revelations, and even supernatural interventions in community crises. These weren't just psychological effects or coincidental outcomes. They were direct results of spiritual practices that had been designed to create openings between the physical and spiritual realms. Her descendants, according to these ancient accounts, became the priests and worship leaders of the righteous lineage. They were the ones who preserved and transmitted the knowledge of how to create sacred space, how to facilitate divine encounter, and how to use worship as a tool for both personal transformation and community building. But the ancient texts also reveal that Miriam's innovations in worship created unexpected problems and challenges. Some people became addicted to the spiritual experiences her ceremonies provided, losing sight of the practical responsibilities that worship was meant to support. Others began to worship the experiences themselves, rather than the divine realities they were meant to reveal. Her story reveals the dangerous potential of spiritual gifts when they're not properly grounded in wisdom and humility. The same abilities that could elevate human consciousness could also be used to manipulate and control. The same practices that could facilitate genuine divine encounter could also create false spiritual experiences that led people away from, rather than toward, truth. The 11th daughter mentioned in these texts was named Tamar, sharing a name with several later biblical figures, but representing a unique approach to preserving and transmitting knowledge in the ancient world. According to the Cave of Treasures, this earlier Tamar was born during the period when information and wisdom were becoming increasingly scattered among humanity's various communities. She was described as possessing remarkable abilities in what we might today call library science and educational methodology. Tamar's gift wasn't just good memory or organizational skills. She could see patterns in information that others missed, understand connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of knowledge, and create systems for preserving and transmitting wisdom that would survive even the most devastating catastrophes. She became humanity's first librarian and teacher, someone who could ensure that important knowledge wouldn't be lost as communities scattered and circumstances changed. The ancient texts describe how Tamar established the first formal schools and libraries among humanity's scattered tribes. She created systems for recording information, methods for teaching complex concepts, and procedures for training others to carry on the work of preservation and transmission. Her educational innovations weren't just practical solutions to immediate problems. They were attempts to ensure that the wisdom gained through both triumph and tragedy would be available to future generations. But Tamar's story reveals something profound about the relationship between knowledge and power in the ancient world. She understood that information could be used to either liberate or enslave, to either enlighten or deceive. Her commitment to preserving and transmitting truth required her to make difficult decisions about what knowledge should be shared openly and what should be restricted to those who had demonstrated the wisdom to use it responsibly. According to these forgotten manuscripts, Tamar developed the first systems of what we might today call intellectual property and academic ethics. She established principles for determining who should have access to what kinds of knowledge, procedures for verifying the accuracy of information, and protocols for preventing the misuse of dangerous or sensitive material. Her descendants, according to the ancient accounts, became the scribes and teachers of the righteous lineage. They were the ones who preserved and transmitted not just information, but also the wisdom to use that information constructively. They became, in essence, the first educators and scholars in human history, establishing traditions of learning and inquiry that would influence intellectual development for millennia. But the ancient texts also reveal that Tamar faced challenges that would test her commitment to truth and education. Some of the knowledge she was asked to preserve contained information that could be used for destructive purposes. Some of the people who sought her teaching had motives that weren't entirely pure. Some of the decisions she had to make about what to teach and what to withhold would inevitably affect the balance of power between different communities and lineages. Her story reveals the complex moral responsibilities that come with being a keeper of knowledge. the burden of having to make decisions that will affect not just individuals, but entire civilizations. She had to learn to balance the value of open inquiry with the need for responsible stewardship, the importance of preserving truth with the necessity of preventing its abuse. The 12th daughter mentioned in these ancient sources was named Bathsheba, sharing a name with the later biblical queen, but representing a different aspect of feminine influence in the ancient world. According to the Book of Jubilees, this earlier Bathsheba was born during the period when economic systems were becoming increasingly complex among humanity's various communities. She was described as possessing extraordinary abilities in what we might today call commerce and trade. Bathsheba's gift wasn't just business acumen or negotiating skills. She could see opportunities that others missed, understand the long-term consequences of economic decisions, and create systems of exchange that benefited everyone involved rather than just the strongest or most cunning. She became humanity's first economist, someone who could help communities develop sustainable prosperity while maintaining ethical standards. The ancient texts describe how Bathsheba's innovations in trade and commerce spread throughout the ancient world, connecting distant communities and creating networks of mutual benefit that would endure for generations. Her understanding of how economic systems could either support or undermine social stability became the foundation for trade practices that would influence commercial development for thousands of years. But Bathsheba's story reveals something that will challenge your understanding of the relationship between wealth and righteousness in the ancient world. According to these forgotten manuscripts, her economic activities weren't just about creating material prosperity. They were attempts to establish systems of exchange that would reflect divine principles of justice and stewardship. The Book of Jubilees describes how Bathsheba's trading networks became vehicles for spreading not just goods and services, but also ideas and values. Her merchants weren't just business people, but also missionaries, carrying messages of hope and redemption to communities that had lost connection with divine purposes. Her descendants, according to these ancient accounts, became the merchants and financiers of the righteous lineage. They were the ones who preserved and transmitted not just commercial knowledge, but also the wisdom to use wealth and resources in ways that served divine purposes rather than merely human ambition. But the ancient texts also reveal that Bathsheba's innovations in commerce created unexpected challenges and temptations. Some people became so focused on material prosperity that they lost sight of the spiritual purposes that wealth was meant to serve. Others began to use economic power to manipulate and control, rather than to serve and benefit. Her story reveals the dangerous potential of economic gifts when they're not properly grounded in spiritual wisdom and moral commitment. The same abilities that could create genuine prosperity could also be used to exploit and oppress. The same systems that could facilitate beneficial exchange could also become tools for injustice and corruption. As we continue to explore these individual stories, we begin to see how each daughter's choices created ripple effects that would influence not just their immediate descendants, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. Their decisions about marriage, family, career, and spiritual commitment became the foundation stones upon which all subsequent human development would be built. But perhaps most significantly, their stories reveal that the challenges they faced weren't just ancient problems. They were eternal questions that continue to confront every human being in every generation. How do we use our gifts and abilities constructively? How do we balance personal desires with communal responsibilities? How do we maintain integrity when faced with pressure to compromise? How do we build something lasting in a world that seems determined to tear down everything we create? The daughters of Adam and Eve were the first women in history to grapple with these questions, and their answers became the templates that would guide every generation that followed. Their successes and failures, their wisdom and mistakes, their triumphs and tragedies, all became part of the foundation upon which human civilization would be built. But the ancient texts reveal something even more profound about these remarkable women. They weren't just responding to circumstances beyond their control. They were actively shaping the kind of world they wanted to create and the kind of legacy they wanted to leave. Their stories challenge us to consider what kind of world we are creating through our daily choices and what kind of legacy we will leave for future generations. The never-told story of the daughters of Adam and Eve isn't just about understanding the past. It's about recognizing the patterns that continue to influence our present and will determine our future. Because the truth is, we are all still living in the world that these women helped create, still dealing with the consequences of their choices, still faced with the same fundamental questions that they had to answer. Their DNA flows through our veins. Their choices echo in our choices. Their victories and defeats continue to shape the very fabric of human existence. Understanding their stories isn't just academic curiosity. It's essential knowledge for anyone who wants to understand the true nature of the human condition and the forces that continue to shape our world. As we prepare to delve even deeper into the most shocking revelations about these ancient daughters, we must prepare ourselves for discoveries that will challenge not just our understanding of history, but our entire conception of what it means to be human. Because according to these forgotten manuscripts, the daughters of Adam and Eve accomplished things that seem impossible by modern standards, suggesting that we have lost more than we have gained in our journey from the ancient world to the modern one. The 13th daughter mentioned in these ancient texts was named Esther, sharing a name with a later biblical queen, but representing an entirely different aspect of feminine courage and leadership. According to the Cave of Treasures, this earlier Esther was born during the period when persecution and oppression were becoming increasingly common among humanity's scattered communities. She was described as possessing extraordinary abilities in what we might today call resistance and liberation. Esther's gift wasn't just physical bravery or strategic thinking. She could inspire others to stand up against injustice, organize communities to resist oppression, and create networks of support that could survive even the most systematic attempts at destruction. She became humanity's first freedom fighter, someone who could help oppressed people find the courage and resources to reclaim their dignity and rights. The ancient texts describe how Esther's methods of resistance spread throughout the ancient world, inspiring communities to stand up against tyranny and helping oppressed people find ways to preserve their identity and values, even under the most difficult circumstances. Her understanding of how to maintain hope and unity in the face of persecution became the foundation for resistance movements that would influence political development for thousands of years. But Esther's story reveals something that will challenge your understanding of the relationship between power and justice in the ancient world. According to these forgotten manuscripts, her resistance activities weren't just political or military actions. They were spiritual warfare, attempts to confront the cosmic forces of evil that were working through human institutions to destroy divine purposes. The Book of Jubilees describes how Esther's liberation efforts involved not just practical strategies, but also spiritual disciplines that could break the chains of oppression that bound both individuals and communities. Her methods weren't just about overthrowing corrupt rulers, but about transforming the spiritual atmosphere that made corruption possible in the first place. Her descendants, according to these ancient accounts, became the liberators and reformers of the righteous lineage. They were the ones who preserved and transmitted not just knowledge of how to resist oppression, but also the wisdom to create just alternatives to corrupt systems. They became, in essence, the first revolutionaries and social reformers in human history. But the ancient texts also reveal that Esther's methods of resistance created unexpected challenges and dangers. Some people became so focused on fighting evil that they lost sight of the good they were trying to protect. Others began to use resistance tactics for personal revenge rather than community liberation. Still, others became so suspicious of authority that they couldn't recognize legitimate leadership when it emerged. Her story reveals the complex moral challenges that come with fighting injustice, the difficulty of maintaining righteousness while confronting evil, and the danger of becoming corrupted by the very forces you're trying to resist. She had to learn to balance the necessity of resistance with the importance of reconciliation, the urgency of action with the need for wisdom. The 14th daughter mentioned in these texts was named Ruth, sharing a name with a later biblical convert, but representing a different aspect of feminine loyalty and commitment. According to the Book of Jubilees, this earlier Ruth was born during the period when migration and displacement were becoming increasingly common among humanity's scattered communities. She was described as possessing remarkable abilities in what we might today call cultural adaptation and community building. Ruth's gift wasn't just personal flexibility or social skills. She could help displaced people maintain their identity while adapting to new circumstances, create bridges between different cultures and communities, and build new forms of social organization that could accommodate diversity while maintaining unity. She became humanity's first cultural anthropologist, someone who could help communities navigate the challenges of change and displacement. The ancient texts describe how Ruth's methods of cultural adaptation spread throughout the ancient world, helping communities survive forced migrations and cultural disruptions while maintaining their essential identity and values. Her understanding of how to preserve what was important while adapting what was necessary became the foundation for cultural practices that would influence social development for thousands of years. But Ruth's story reveals something profound about the relationship between identity and adaptation in the ancient world. According to these forgotten manuscripts, her cultural work wasn't just about practical survival strategies. It was about understanding the deeper spiritual and psychological needs that must be met for communities to thrive in new environments. The Book of Jubilees describes how Ruth's community-building efforts involved not just practical organization, but also spiritual practices that could help people maintain their connection to divine purposes, even when everything familiar had been stripped away. Her methods weren't just about creating new social structures, but about helping people discover their deeper identity that transcended circumstances. Her descendants, according to these ancient accounts, became the bridge builders and peacemakers of the righteous lineage. They were the ones who preserved and transmitted not just knowledge of how to adapt to change, but also the wisdom to help others navigate transitions without losing their essential identity. They became, in essence, the first social workers and community organizers in human history. But the ancient texts also reveal that Ruth's methods of cultural adaptation created unexpected problems and tensions. Some people became so focused on fitting in that they lost sight of the values and principles that made their identity worth preserving. Others became so concerned with maintaining tradition that they couldn't adapt to necessary changes. Still others became so skilled at building bridges that they lost their own sense of where they belonged. Her story reveals the delicate balance required to maintain identity while embracing change, the difficulty of preserving what is essential while adapting what is necessary, and the challenge of helping others navigate transitions without losing yourself in the process. She had to learn to distinguish between surface changes that were merely cosmetic and deeper transformations that touched the core of human identity. The 15th daughter mentioned in these ancient sources was named Mary, sharing a name with the later mother of Jesus, but representing a different aspect of feminine receptivity and spiritual sensitivity. According to the Cave of Treasures, this earlier Mary was born during the period when direct divine communication was becoming increasingly rare among humanity's scattered communities. She was described as possessing extraordinary abilities in what we might today call prophecy and spiritual discernment. Mary's gift wasn't just religious intuition or mystical experience. She could receive and interpret divine messages, understand the spiritual significance of natural events, and help communities discern the will of God in complex situations. She became humanity's first prophet, someone who could maintain connection with divine purposes, even when the heavens seemed silent. The ancient texts describe how Mary's prophetic abilities spread throughout the ancient world, helping communities understand the spiritual dimensions of their experiences and maintain hope even during the darkest periods. Her understanding of how to receive and interpret divine revelation became the foundation for prophetic traditions that would influence religious development for thousands of years. But Mary's story reveals something that will challenge your understanding of the relationship between divine revelation and human responsibility in the ancient world. According to these forgotten manuscripts, her prophetic work wasn't just about receiving messages from God. It was about helping people understand their role in fulfilling divine purposes and their responsibility to respond appropriately to divine revelation. The Book of Jubilees describes how Mary's prophetic ministry involved not just speaking God's word, but also helping people understand how to live in response to that word. Her methods weren't just about predicting the future, but about helping people make choices that would align with divine purposes. and contribute to the fulfillment of divine plans. Her descendants, according to these ancient accounts, became the prophets and spiritual guides of the righteous lineage. They were the ones who preserved and transmitted not just the ability to receive divine revelation, but also the wisdom to interpret that revelation and apply it to practical situations. They became, in essence, the first religious leaders and spiritual counselors in human history. But the ancient texts also reveal that Mary's prophetic gifts created unexpected challenges and responsibilities. Some people became so dependent on divine guidance that they lost the ability to make their own decisions. Others began to use prophetic abilities for personal gain rather than community benefit. Still, others became so focused on spiritual realities that they neglected practical responsibilities. Her story reveals the complex challenges that come with serving as a mediator between divine and human realms, the burden of having to deliver messages that people might not want to hear, and the responsibility of helping others understand and respond to divine revelation. She had to learn to balance the urgency of divine messages with the need for human understanding, the authority of divine revelation with the importance of human response. As we continue to explore these remarkable stories, we begin to see how each daughter's unique gifts and calling contributed to the development of human civilization in ways that we're only beginning to understand. Their individual choices and achievements weren't just personal accomplishments. They were contributions to a larger tapestry of human development that would influence every generation that followed. But perhaps most significantly, their stories reveal that the gifts and callings they exercised weren't just ancient phenomena. They were expressions of potentials that still exist within humanity, capabilities that still await discovery and development, purposes that still await fulfillment. Their lives challenge us to consider what gifts we might possess that we haven't yet discovered, what callings we might have that we haven't yet embraced, what contributions we might make that we haven't yet imagined. The never-told story of the daughters of Adam and Eve isn't just about understanding remarkable women who lived long ago. It's about recognizing the remarkable potential that exists within every human being, the unique contributions that each person can make to the ongoing development of human civilization, and the eternal purposes that give meaning and significance to every human life. Their legacy lives on not just in their descendants, but in every person who chooses to embrace their gifts, pursue their calling, and contribute to the great work of building a world that reflects divine purposes and serves human flourishing. The daughters of Adam and Eve established the foundation. Now it's up to us to complete the structure they began, to fulfill the purposes they initiated, and to realize the potential they discovered. But as we prepare to uncover the most shocking revelations about these ancient daughters, we must prepare ourselves for discoveries that will challenge not just our understanding of the past, but our entire conception of what the future might hold. Because according to these forgotten manuscripts, the story of the daughters of Adam and Eve isn't finished. It continues in every generation, waiting for those who have the courage to embrace their full potential and the wisdom to use their gifts in service of purposes greater than themselves. The story we've been uncovering tonight reaches its most profound revelation when we examine the 16th daughter mentioned in these ancient texts. Her name was Phoebe, and according to the Book of Jubilees, she was born during the period when the very fabric of reality was beginning to shift in ways that would fundamentally alter human existence forever. She was described as possessing abilities that transcended anything we've discussed so far, gifts that would challenge your understanding of what human beings were originally capable of achieving. Phoebe's calling wasn't just spiritual or practical. She was described as being able to perceive and interact with dimensions of reality that had been hidden from most of humanity since the fall. The ancient texts speak of her as the first dimensional explorer, someone who could navigate between different levels of existence and bring back knowledge that would transform human understanding of the universe itself. According to these forgotten manuscripts, Phoebe didn't just see visions or receive revelations. She could actually travel between what the texts describe as the seven heavens, exploring realms of existence that most humans could only dream about. Her journeys weren't just mystical experiences, but actual expeditions into territories that existed beyond the physical universe, places where the laws of time and space operated according to different principles. The implications of Phoebe's abilities are staggering. The ancient texts describe her returning from these journeys with knowledge of technologies and capabilities that wouldn't be rediscovered by human civilization for thousands of years. She brought back understanding of energy manipulation, consciousness expansion, and reality modification that her descendants would use to accomplish feats that seem impossible by modern standards. But Phoebe's story reveals something that will shake your understanding of why these abilities were eventually lost. According to the Book of Jubilees, her dimensional travels weren't just innocent exploration. They were reconnaissance missions into realms where the spiritual forces behind human rebellion were planning their next moves against divine purposes. She was, in essence, humanity's first intelligence operative, gathering information that would prove crucial for understanding and resisting the cosmic conspiracy that was unfolding. Her descendants, according to these ancient accounts, became the guardians of interdimensional knowledge, the keepers of secrets that could either elevate humanity to unprecedented heights or destroy civilization entirely. They were the ones who understood that the battle for human destiny wasn't just being fought on Earth, but across multiple dimensions of reality, involving forces and entities that most people couldn't even imagine. The 17th daughter mentioned in these texts was named Priscilla, and her story reveals perhaps the most shocking truth about the ancient world that we've uncovered tonight. According to the Cave of Treasures, Priscilla was born during the period when certain daughters of Adam and Eve were beginning to intermarry with the mysterious beings mentioned in Genesis chapter 6 as the sons of God. But Priscilla's story goes far beyond simple intermarriage. She was described as becoming the first human being to successfully bridge the gap between human and angelic consciousness. The ancient texts describe Priscilla as possessing not just beauty or wisdom, but an entirely different kind of awareness, a consciousness that could operate simultaneously in both human and angelic modes of existence. She wasn't just interacting with these mysterious beings. She was learning to think like them, to perceive reality from their perspective, and to access capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. According to these forgotten manuscripts, Priscilla's transformation wasn't just personal. It was the beginning of a new phase in human evolution, the emergence of a hybrid consciousness that would combine the best of both human and angelic capabilities. Her children would possess not just enhanced physical abilities, but also expanded mental capacities, spiritual sensitivities, and creative potentials that would make them the founders of the great civilizations mentioned in ancient texts. But Priscilla's story also reveals the terrible price of this transformation. The ancient texts describe how her expanded consciousness came with expanded responsibility, expanded temptation, and expanded potential for both creation and destruction. She had gained access to knowledge and power that could reshape reality itself, but she had also opened herself to influences and pressures that could corrupt her in ways that ordinary humans couldn't even comprehend. Her descendants, according to these ancient accounts, became the builders of the megalithic structures that still puzzle archaeologists today, the creators of technologies that seem impossible for their supposed time period, and the establishers of knowledge systems that would influence human civilization for millennia. But they also became the source of the corruption and violence that would eventually require divine intervention to cleanse. The 18th daughter mentioned in these texts was named Lydia, and her story reveals something that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the relationship between human creativity and divine inspiration. According to the Book of Jubilees, Lydia was born during the period when the arts and sciences were reaching unprecedented heights among humanity's scattered communities. But her gifts went far beyond normal artistic or intellectual ability. Lydia was described as being able to create works of art that were more than just beautiful or meaningful. They were transformative, capable of altering the consciousness of anyone who experienced them. Her paintings could induce visions. Her music could heal both physical and spiritual ailments, and her poetry could unlock hidden potentials within the human mind and soul. The ancient texts describe how Lydia's creations became tools for both elevation and manipulation, instruments that could be used to inspire righteousness or to seduce people into corruption. Her artistic innovations weren't just aesthetic achievements. They were technologies of consciousness, methods for influencing human behavior and perception in ways that would prove both beneficial and dangerous. But Lydia's story reveals something profound about the relationship between creativity and responsibility. The ancient texts describe her struggle to understand how her gifts should be used, whether artistic ability carried with it moral obligations, and what responsibilities came with the power to influence human consciousness through creative expression. Her descendants, according to these ancient accounts, became the masters of what we might today call psychotechnology, the use of artistic and creative methods to influence human consciousness and behavior. They were the ones who understood that art wasn't just decoration or entertainment, but a powerful tool for shaping reality and transforming human experience. The 19th daughter mentioned in these texts was named Tabitha, and her story reveals perhaps the most mysterious aspect of the ancient world that we've encountered tonight. According to the Cave of Treasures, Tabitha was born during the period when certain daughters of Adam and Eve were beginning to discover that they possessed abilities that transcended not just normal human limitations, but even the enhanced capabilities of their sisters. Tabitha was described as being able to manipulate what the ancient texts call the fundamental forces of creation, the basic energies and principles that hold the universe together. She could alter the flow of time, change the properties of matter, and even influence the operation of what we would today call natural laws. Her abilities weren't just supernatural, they were cosmic, touching the very foundations of reality itself. The ancient texts describe how Tabitha's experiments with these fundamental forces led to discoveries that would transform human understanding of the universe. She learned how to harness energy directly from the cosmic background, how to manipulate gravitational fields, and how to create what the texts describe as bridges between different dimensions of space and time. But Tabitha's story also reveals the ultimate danger of possessing such capabilities. The ancient texts describe how her manipulations of fundamental forces began to create instabilities in the cosmic order itself, threatening not just human civilization but the entire structure of reality. Her experiments were creating ripple effects that could potentially unravel the very fabric of existence. Her descendants, according to these ancient accounts, became the guardians of cosmic knowledge, the keepers of secrets that were too dangerous for general human use. They were the ones who understood that some capabilities were too powerful for fallen humanity to handle responsibly, that some knowledge was too dangerous to be preserved, and that some experiments were too risky to be continued. The 20th and final daughter mentioned in these ancient texts was named Salome, and her story brings us to the ultimate revelation about the daughters of Adam and Eve. According to the Book of Jubilees, Salome was born during the period when the cosmic experiment of the ancient world was reaching its climactic conclusion. She was described as possessing the ability to see across time itself, to perceive the ultimate consequences of all the choices being made by her family and their descendants. Salome's gift wasn't just prophecy or foresight. She could actually perceive the entire timeline of human history, understanding how each decision made in the ancient world would ripple through the generations, influencing events and circumstances thousands of years in the future. She was, in essence, humanity's first temporal observer, someone who could see the big picture of human destiny from beginning to end. The ancient texts describe how Salome's temporal perceptions revealed the true scope of what was happening in the ancient world. The daughters of Adam and Eve weren't just establishing different family lines or creating various approaches to human civilization. They were participating in a cosmic experiment that would determine the entire future of human existence, an experiment that would influence not just earthly history, but the eternal destiny of every human soul. But Salome's story reveals the most shocking truth of all. According to these forgotten manuscripts, she could see that the ancient world was heading toward a catastrophic conclusion, that the experiments with enhanced human capabilities and interdimensional knowledge were creating instabilities that would require divine intervention to resolve. She could perceive the coming flood not just as divine judgment, but as cosmic necessity, the only way to prevent the complete collapse of reality itself. Her descendants, according to these ancient accounts, became the preservers of the most essential knowledge, the ones who would ensure that the lessons learned through the successes and failures of the ancient world would be available to guide future generations. They were the ones who understood that the story of the daughters of Adam and Eve wasn't ending with the flood, but was being preserved for a future time when humanity would be ready to handle such knowledge responsibly. And this brings us to the ultimate revelation about the never-told story of the daughters of Adam and Eve. According to these ancient texts, their story wasn't just about the distant past. It was about the eternal pattern of human development, the recurring cycle of potential and corruption, elevation and fall, that would characterize human existence throughout all generations. The capabilities they discovered, the knowledge they preserved, and the choices they made weren't just ancient history. They were templates for understanding the challenges and opportunities that would face every generation of humanity, including our own. Their stories weren't just about what happened long ago. They were about what could happen again, what might happen soon, and what will ultimately happen when human beings finally learn to use their full potential in service of divine purposes. The daughters of Adam and Eve established patterns that continue to influence human development today. Their DNA flows through our veins, their choices echo in our choices, and their potential awaits rediscovery in every generation. Understanding their stories isn't just academic curiosity. It's essential preparation for the challenges and opportunities that await us as we continue to explore the full scope of human potential. Their legacy reminds us that we are more than we appear to be, that we carry within ourselves capabilities that we have barely begun to explore, and that we participate in a cosmic story that began before time and will continue beyond the boundaries of space. The never-told story of the daughters of Adam and Eve isn't just about them. It's about us, about our potential, about our destiny, and about the eternal purposes that give meaning to every human life. Tonight, we have uncovered secrets that have been hidden for millennia, revealed truths that challenge our understanding of human history and human potential, and discovered patterns that continue to influence our world today. The daughters of Adam and Eve weren't just ancient women whose stories happen to be interesting. They were the pioneers who established the foundation upon which all human civilization has been built, the explorers who discovered the full scope of human potential, and the guardians who preserved the knowledge that would guide humanity through its darkest hours. Their story continues in every woman who chooses to embrace her gifts, every person who decides to pursue their calling, and every generation that dares to believe that human beings are capable of more than they have yet achieved. The daughters of Adam and Eve showed us what is possible. Now it's up to us to decide what we will do with the potential they discovered and the legacy they preserved. The ancient texts tell us that these 20 daughters represent more than individual women with remarkable gifts. They represent the complete spectrum of human potential, the full range of capabilities that were built into humanity from the very beginning. Each daughter discovered and developed a different aspect of what it means to be made in the image of God. And together they created a comprehensive map of human possibility that has guided every generation since. But here's what makes this discovery truly extraordinary. According to the Book of Jubilees and other ancient sources, these daughters didn't just live their lives and disappear into history. They established what the texts call the feminine mysteries, a body of knowledge and practice that was designed to be preserved and transmitted through the female line of humanity until the time when the world would be ready to receive it fully. These feminine mysteries weren't just religious rituals or cultural traditions. They were comprehensive systems for understanding and developing human potential, methods for accessing capabilities that most people didn't even know existed. They included techniques for consciousness expansion, practices for interdimensional communication, and protocols for safely handling knowledge and power that could either elevate or destroy human civilization. The ancient texts describe how these mysteries were carefully guarded and selectively transmitted, passed down through generations of women who understood their significance and their danger. They were preserved not as historical curiosities, but as practical knowledge that would prove essential when humanity finally reached the level of development where such capabilities could be used responsibly. And according to these forgotten manuscripts, that time is now. The daughters of Adam and Eve didn't just live in the ancient past. They were preparing for the modern era, anticipating a time when human beings would once again be ready to explore the full scope of their potential and fulfill the purposes for which they were originally created. Their stories weren't just about what happened long ago. They were about what's happening now, what's about to happen, and what will ultimately happen when humanity finally learns to integrate ancient wisdom with modern understanding, divine purpose with human capability, and eternal significance with temporal responsibility. The never-told story of the daughters of Adam and Eve has been waiting for this moment, waiting for a generation that would be ready to receive it, understand it, and apply it to the challenges and opportunities of our time. Their legacy isn't just in museums or history books. It's in the potential that still exists within every human being, the capabilities that still await discovery, and the purposes that still await fulfillment. Tonight, we have uncovered more than ancient history. We have discovered the blueprint for human potential, the map of human possibility, and the foundation upon which the future of human civilization will be built. The daughters of Adam and Eve weren't just remarkable women who lived long ago. They were the architects of human destiny, the pioneers who explored the frontiers of human capability, and the guardians who preserved the knowledge that would guide us home. Their story is our story. Their potential is our potential. Their destiny is our destiny. And their legacy lives on in every person who chooses to embrace their gifts, pursue their calling, and contribute to the great work of building a world that reflects divine purposes and serves human flourishing. The hidden story has been revealed. The ancient secrets have been uncovered. The forgotten legacy has been restored. Now it's up to us to decide what we will do with this knowledge, how we will use this understanding, and what kind of world we will create with the potential that has been entrusted to us. The daughters of Adam and Eve have spoken across the centuries. Their message is clear. We are more than we know. We are capable of more than we imagine, and we are called to purposes greater than we have yet dared to dream. The never-told story of the daughters of Adam and Eve is no longer hidden. It has been revealed for this generation, for this moment, for this purpose. The question now is whether we will have the courage to embrace it, the wisdom to understand it, and the commitment to live it out in our own lives and in our own time. Their legacy awaits. Their potential beckons. Their destiny calls. The story continues with us, thus.